Hello everybody, the Nameless Narcissist here once again. Simple man, diagnosed with NPD, giving you the facts of narcissistic personality disorder and the things that go on in my head. If you like this video, please like, comment, and subscribe, and keep in mind, I am no clinician. I can only speak to my own experiences and the research I read. So this is a new thing. Doing show reviews. I didn't really expect to go down this route, but I felt like it was relevant and I do enjoy this TV show. So I'm going to start this off giving my opinions on the show You and a little bit of a synopsis for those who aren't familiar with it. Go into some of the research around mental health and mental illness and homicide. And I'm going to finish it off with, you guessed it, trying to figure out what fucking mental illness the main character has. So, You is an interesting show. It's basically following a protagonist who is ostensibly a terrible, terrible person. He's a stalker and a murderer and has done very, very bad things. But the interesting part about it is it's making you sympathize and put yourself in the position of somebody who is a murderer, who is doing bad things. You get to hear his rationalization. You get to hear why he does it. And there are basically it has the same format every season. He obsesses over a girl, he stalks her, he gets her to fall in love with him, and he ends up killing her. Basically how it goes, right? And it's a fascinating show. I really enjoy it. It has some weird social commentaries on certain cultural circles, ranging from the West Coast younger groups to the British aristocracy in this latest season. I do have some issues with it. The main one being, I feel like sometimes they almost paint him in too good of a light, trying to get you to sympathize with this person. But they just seem very interesting, where almost every season there's somebody who you're basically forced to hate. They're like one of them was a straight up like child molester, right? And every time he actually confronts one of these people, they make comments about how they're like the protagonists in them. And then they accuse him of being in denial about it, which I think is a very cool and subtle way to kind of be like, hey, this is a shitty person. I know the writers aren't intentionally making him out to be better than, like, to glorify a murderer and stuff like that, because they stated that eventually he's going to get what he deserves, and I imagine when the show ends. But I feel like they ride the line a little too close sometimes, because I think, especially since it's like an attractive white dude, so he's like, you know, like you already have a predisposition to kind of like him because, you know, intrinsically we're more likely to trust and like attractive people. And I think they make you sympathize with him too well, right? His rationalizations sometimes just come off too much. I feel like they did it the best in the first season. They really tread the line better, but whatever. Anyways, so after that, they make quite a few references to mental health, especially in this last season. A lot of the term narcissist, and you know how I love that, the term narcissist being thrown around, especially in relation to some of the higher ups, right? Which I find interesting because like, you know, narcissist is a pejorative for the most part. People don't really associate it with personality pathology. But the writers threw in a little comment that I would have almost missed if it weren't for the fact that, you know, I view the lens through the world of personality pathology, where one of the characters made a statement referring to somebody and saying that they had a crippling personality disorder, which shows me that they know like some of the terminology that they're using. They know that narcissism is a personality disorder. And again, they make several references to mental health throughout the show. And I don't like the implications there because it feels like and like, don't get me wrong, there is a lot of negative effects on society due to mental illness and stuff like that. But it feels like they're trying to associate the behaviors of a serial killer and a stalker on mental illness. So I decided that I'm going to kind of delve into the research literature regarding mental health and, you know, murder. So I read a couple studies. The primary one that I'm going to be referencing is one by Stone something. It was Mass Murder, Mental Health, and Men is what the study was called. And he had 228 cases where he identified mental illnesses in these subjects. It was originally 235, but 7 of them were, he said, like, not fit to be analyzed. I want to point out that the majority of these people who were mentally ill were either schizophrenic or bipolar. That may have been a different study, but that was a significant population, right? But even more interestingly is this guy was a specialist, or is a specialist in personality pathology. So he's kind of viewing the world through this lens. Some of you may know psychoanalytic theory. There is several levels of functioning: neurotic level, borderline level, and psychotic level. And usually if you have a personality disorder, you're in the borderline level of functioning, right? That's when you're going to have some significant impairments in your life, and but not to the level that you're straight up out of touch with reality. And you can kind of see how he views the world through this lens, because he viewed people with paranoid schizophrenia as under the umbrella of paranoid personality disorder, which that is not true. Or at least the consensus in academia nowadays is that that's not true, right? Schizophrenia and personality pathology are two separate things, even though genetically cluster A personality disorders are associated with schizophrenia. And of note, the majority of the people with personality, he said that, it says that 48 of the 228 of the people that he diagnosed, that were studied, he said that 48 of them had paranoid personality disorder. It makes you wonder how many of those people were actually schizophrenic that he diagnosed as paranoid personality disorder. 23% of murderers are mentally ill, right? Which is actually a underrepresentation of mental illness. Because around, I think, 50% of the population at some point in their lifetime will have a mental illness. But in fairness, there is a very narrow view of mental illness here, right? Limited to the DSM. And also they didn't include people with substance abuse issues, which you'll see later is actually a huge indicator of homicidal and mass murdering behaviors. And then 32% of mass murderers. In another study, it found that in about 518 people, about 10% were 10% had schizophrenia or bipolar or some other psychotic disorder. In addition, 42 of those people were diagnosed with mania or major depressive disorder, which, fascinatingly enough though, 80% of them, all of the people, received some sort of psychiatric treatment in the past, of all these murderers. Which makes you think, is it that, which makes me think, like, is this a limitation of the DSM? Because obviously they did, a lot of these people did have some sort of mental stuff going on. Was it a mental disorder or just they're weird? But obviously all of them had something going on. So is this a limitation of the DSM, or is this a group of people that can never be categorized categorically or in a homogenous way to be able to give them any real treatment? And then that begs the question, if you can't treat them, is it a mental illness? Keep in mind, you do have to have clinical distress or impairments in your functioning to, I guess, in fairness, I guess if you're murdering people, that might be an impairment, and end up in jail, that might be an impairment to your functioning, right? So maybe by definition, murder has to be a mental illness, but it is not any mental illness that we are familiar with. Another study showed that, actually this was the meta-analysis, 10% of murderers had personality disorders, which you might think, whoa, that's high, until you remember that 10% of the population has a personality disorder. So actually, people with personality disorders are just as likely to be murderers as anybody else. And actually, 38% of people who, 38% of those people had problems with substance abuse, particularly alcohol abuse. So if you're ever being like, oh, narcissists are murderers, right? Or sociopaths are murderers and stuff like that, keep in mind somebody with alcohol dependency is more likely to be a murderer than somebody with personality disorder. You also have to keep in mind, it didn't specify what kind of personality disorder. So it's a possibility some of the personality disorders were underrepresented and then some were overrepresented. Like they said, ASPD was represented. So it makes sense. Schizophrenia was also, once again, found to be a good predictor, not a predictor, but an overrepresentation in the people who were murderers. Which I find interesting, right? Because I feel like we, as a society, demonize personality disorders to a large degree. We associate with murder, theft, unstable interpersonal relationships, which that one is objectively true. But it's more likely that somebody with the bipolar one, at first surprised me, but you have to keep in mind when somebody's manic, they're almost, even compared to a narcissist grandiosity, their grandiosity is like so much more, to the point of delusion. It's like they'll go and spend all their money gambling because they're like, I know I'm going to win, because they're manic and out of touch. Can't fucking comprehend anything. Anyways, so main character of the show, Joel Goldberg, the murderer, the stalker, the creepy guy who masturbates outside women's windows. How do I view his mental illness? So he does show what I find, and I want to point out, he has a strange constellation of personality traits that would not be common to find in any real individual. And I think it's kind of designed that way so that the audience can actually sympathize with him, to put you in the shoes of this person. And I don't think I don't think they're trying to do that in a way of like, we need to sympathize with murderers. I think it's in a way of trying to make somebody uncomfortable, which I do not think they do a good job of, because I do not feel, well, okay, maybe I'm not a good example, but I don't feel like most people feel uncomfortable identifying with this person most of the time. I remember one guy that I talked to when I worked at a prison. Okay, also not a good example. I've known people who they're like, yeah, I'm straight rooting for him at this point. So clearly the writers of this show aren't getting their message across that they were intending to. But yeah, he shows a very cluster B pattern, I would say, especially with his fixation on relationships, some of his mood outbursts. Also factor 1 psychopathy. He can be very cold. He has a superficial charm. He's very, I don't know, what's the word? He's charming, he's cold, calculated, like what you would associate with psychopathy, right? And for those of you that don't know, factor 1 psychopathy is what is colloquially referred to as psychopathy. Factor 2 psychopathy is what is called sociopathy. Sociopathy is related to a lot of impairments in functioning, very neurotic, impulsive, some paranoia. Like, they're very unhappy people. Psychopaths are like cold, calculated, charming. You know, your Ted Bundy types. No, not Ted Bundy. Not all psychopaths are killers, and most of them, vast majority of them aren't. So moving on, I actually went through the list of all diagnostic criteria for personality disorders. We also have to keep in mind as we go through this that I am basing this off of it because a lot of the show has to do with his internal monologue, like what's he thinking. And a lot of these diagnostic criteria are based off of external behaviors. So it's kind of unfair to try and match him to these criteria because I can't really, his external behaviors are, I'm going to base it off of his internal cognition, so there's going to be a mismatch. So with a personality disorder, you have to, this manifests as a manifestation that deviates from cultural norms in cognition, so the way that we think is fucking different. In affectivity, so like the way we express emotions is different. Interpersonal functioning, the way we have relationships are different, as in usually bad, and impulse control. And it has to interfere with your social, occupational, or clinically significant, or you have to have clinically significant distress. Which I want to point out, I do think that he murders a lot of people, which I would find to be impairments of functioning, and he murders his girlfriends, and so I would say that's distressing, and I would say he definitely thinks differently than people too, and has different emotions, yada, yada, yada. So, interesting enough, when I was talking about paranoid personality disorder being one of the biggest groups in terms of the murderers, I found, like, he did have some, significant traits of paranoid personality disorder. For example, preoccupation with trustworthiness of others. Throughout the entire show, he's like suspicious of people, thinking that they are not people who are to be trusted. He's very condescending towards them too, but still reluctant to indulge personal information, fear it's used against him. Yes, like the entire show, he's hiding everything about himself as much as he can, which is something that I found interesting. One of the major traits that I actually did find narcissistic is how he is hiding the self, so to speak. Hidden messages from benign remarks. He thinks everything's a fucking hidden message and stuff. It's like, it could be his catchphrase. What did they mean by that? Recurrent suspicions of infidelity, and without any sort of reasoning for it. Yes. He, especially in the first season, he randomly thought his girlfriend was cheating on him, more or less. So he went through her phone, murdered the guy that she was, locked her in a box, normal fucking crazy person shit. Not normal crazy person shit, normal crazy as in murderer crazy. Then I didn't find any traits else in the cluster A. Let's go cluster B though. Antisocial personality disorder, sociopathy. Deceitfulness, yes, he's constantly lying. Aggressiveness, he does in murderers. I would say that matches. Lack of remorse. See, it's weird with him because he does seem to have this lack of remorse usually, but like then there's like, I feel like it's more driven out of fear of getting caught, I guess. So I would say a lack of remorse, but he does have a lot more. He isn't remorseful about murdering, but he seems remorseful when like he fucks up with his girl. Again, he has a big preoccupation with these women. It like dominates all of his motivations throughout the show. With BPD, I only found like difficulty controlling anger because, you know, he gets mad at somebody who wronged his girl and fucking murders them. And then NPD, which I did find the biggest overlap. One, Grandiosity thinks that he is some special, unique person, I would say so. Especially special and unique through these partners that he's with. He's preoccupied with, and this is another symptom criteria, preoccupied with these ideas of ideal love. He's always trying to find the one, his soulmate. Is convinced that love finds a way, right? He believes that believes that he's special like that. And with grandiosity, I always associate grandiosity with hierarchical thinking. Not so much of I'm great, but I'm better than. But of note, it seems that his grandiosity is egocentric in a way that's genuine. And we have to keep in mind, factor one, psychopaths are grandiose, but they genuinely believe in it. With narcissists like myself, it's compensatory, right? Like we're trying to cover up those deep feelings of inadequacy. Meanwhile, this guy actually believes all of this. But yeah, he thinks he's very much better than other people. And entitlement, I would say that he is entitled. He feels entitled to what he perceives as his ideal love, right? Hence why he stalks them. Stalking to me is a form of entitlement, if I'm being honest. And I think that's why we do see a lot of people who do stalk with significant narcissistic traits, because that entitlement. He's entitled to these women. And then the last criteria, arrogance. He's not arrogant, but he's condescending. His internal monologue is basically this entire thing of, oh, I'm so much better than all these people around me. And it doesn't matter. It's like always. So it's an all-pervasive trait too. But the most important thing about narcissism that he's missing is the need for admiration. Narcissists, that's like the only trait of ours that does not go into remission, because we always need people to be feeding our self-esteem, right? That's the core of narcissism right there, is this need for affirmation to manage our self-esteem regulation. He doesn't really interpersonally exploit unless it's for the means of getting a girl to like him, more or less. And he has no envy, which I also think is a huge part of narcissism. He also, and I would say he lacks empathy, but he doesn't lack empathy for the women he's with. But we go through all these traits, and for the most part, and you have to realize that, by the end of me writing all these down, I was like, is he even mentally ill? Almost all these traits are driven by the fact that he's a murderer, that he's the paranoia, the deceitfulness, and then the lack of remorse, I guess, is more of a cause of the murder. It's all related to the murder, though. This is a personality pathology that is constellated around the fact that he is a murderer. So I would struggle to say that this is even a construct that can be diagnosed. I mean, it isn't. I don't think this guy would get I doubt he would get any diagnoses and treatment, because you gotta keep in mind, all of these have to be pervasive in every area of your life. For him, sure it is, but it's because he's a fucking murderer. I doubt he would be lying as much, hiding the self as much, being paranoid as much if he wasn't fucking killing people. I actually take it back about remorse. He did lack remorse when he thought he killed his first girlfriend. Right now. But yeah, I don't know. The messages that are being taught in this show have me kind of disillusioned with it. I love the show. I think it's really interesting. But I feel like people have to go into it with this kind of skepticism nowadays. I feel like it's having a worse impact than the writers really intended. Not a worse impact really, because I imagine the impact is very small, but I feel like the message they've kind of lost their message. The first season did such a great job of making you feel uncomfortable. Well, the first episode, the first season at the very least, did a great job of making you feel uncomfortable by being in this guy's shoes, right? The first, this part that stuck with me was he just did something really nice and stuff like that, and you're like sympathizing with him, you're like, oh, that's great. And then it like goes to the woman that he's stalking, like he's not really stalking her, just he happened to see her in her window. And that pans back to him and he's like, you know, doing the bad thing that you shouldn't do when you look at women, especially not in public. And that was great in making me uncomfortable with the fact that I was identifying with somebody who is a really bad person, a creepy person, again, a murderer, a stalker. I don't know if he murdered anybody at that point, but still, he was a stalker. You know, nobody that, you know, is all right I don't even think people who are stalkers want to identify with stalkers. And that's something he does throughout this, is calling other people creeps. He's like he'll judge people who are stalking and stuff like that, or being obsessive over somebody, and doesn't acknowledge his own thing. And I think that actually is a trait, that is probably a trait that is common in stalkers, right? It's like, oh yeah, they're creepy as hell, but I'm justified. I'm entitled, right? But yeah, that's kind of my take on it. I don't think a lot of people are going to agree with me on this, and I was kind of disjointed and didn't really, I don't know. God damn it, this video is bad. I'm sorry. But I don't know. That's my take on it. Hope you all have a good day. And take your fucking meds, please.